What's on your radar, Briahna?
Why can't conservative pundits stop defending corporate elites? That's the question I'm exploring today on my radar, Robbie. And here's why. This country might be divided on a number of cultural issues, but when it comes to tax policy, we've agreed. Working people are taxed too much, and elites aren't paying their fair share. 71% of voters supported raising taxes on the wealthiest 2% of Americans to pay for the Build Back Better Act. A 2020 poll showed that 64% of Americans, including a majority of Republicans, believe that the very rich should contribute an extra share of their total wealth each year to support public programs, in effect, a wealth tax. 62% of voters supported Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax. And yet, despite holding themselves out as members of the party of populism, many conservative pundits and politicos seem to disagree with their base when it comes to taxes. The reason why? It seems they're looking out for their own fat bank accounts. Listen to Fox's Brian Kilmeade misrepresent how marginal tax policy works.
The other thing she brought up is the fact that she wants people taxed as high as 80-90% if you make $10 million or more, or she calls them the tippy top. Mm-hmm. So that's great. If you want to find out how to tell people not to make a lot of money, you take 80% of what they make and tell them we're taking it all, and they won't do it.
The 60 or 70% rate kicks in at 10 million. Everything else is progressive up to that.
Makes sense. I would also
That's
add,
how it
yeah,
works.
that's great.
So many tears for those $10 million earners. And did you notice that correction by Ducey there? He's right. A marginal tax rate means that the high 70% number that they were talking about only applies to money made over the large base sum. In the case of Elizabeth Warren's plan, 2 cents on every dollar made after your first 50 million. 50 million. But these pundits seem to think that millionaires, including many of themselves, should be the prime beneficiaries of American tax policy. Let's remember the context. Americans are working harder and producing more than they were 70 years ago, when the marginal tax rate was more than 90%. In the post-war era, the average worker to CEO ratio was about 30-1 in terms of pay. Now it's over 300-1. American productivity is up, but wages have not kept track. And with all of the talk of inflation and price increases, it will be hard-pressed to find a conservative pundit who will argue that workers should simply be paid more. I'll remind you, we are in the longest period in American history without a minimum wage raise since the advent of the minimum wage in 1938. So why is no one on the right ringing the alarm bell here? Well, conservative pundits simply don't share your class interests, just like elite Democratic pundits don't share the interests of ordinary Americans. Just listen to this recent clip from Fox News.
And then we also heard a lot of talk about fair share, paying your fair share, and a lot of people aren't paying their fair share, et cetera. It turns out, because the president released his 2021 tax forms, that his family paid 24.6% of their income in federal taxes. Now, I paid 37%. I would much rather pay his fair share than my fair share. I mean, the point is, what are they doing? They're such hypocrites. They're advising something that they don't deal with at all. They're not paying their fair share, so why should anybody else?
Now, I want to say first that corporate Democrats are, of course, hypocrites when it comes to taxes. I'm not sure why Joe Biden's tax bracket appears to be relatively low despite his over $600,000 in income. But note that although the majority of Republicans support raising taxes on the rich, host David Asman doesn't take this opportunity to argue that Biden's taxes should be higher to match his own. No. He argues that his own taxes should be lower. Love a guy making over $500,000 painting himself as the real victim here. The mask off moment doesn't end there.
It's a great point, and it's something that everyone thinks that someone else is taxed more than they should be, but they never say that about themselves. And those of us who are the conservative side, who are largely loath to raise taxes, are always cognizant of the fact that people want to be freer. They want to have opportunity. They want to be able to make their own decisions. This is not about whether something gets spent on something. I'm going to spend money on housing. I'm just going to spend it either for my own housing or through a nonprofit to be able to ensure that my community has housing. I don't want the Department of Housing and Urban Development to have a big spending woke bureaucrat doing that housing spending on behalf of someone else with my money. That's how we look at it. That's not the way they look at it. They just want to raise taxes across the country.
No woke bureaucracy. Let's just hope that that guy sets up a housing trust. That guest, Russ Vought, the director of the Office of Budget and Management under Trump, he argued that people want to be freer and have opportunity. That's true. But he's arguing that this is not about whether someone gets something spent on something. He embraces the vagueness to hide what he's really saying. And the reality is that whether something gets spent on something matters if that something is housing. And you're one of the 50% of American workers who say can't afford a one-bedroom apartment. It's not very freeing to face eviction or endure a long commute or live with tons of roommates even though you work hard 40 hours plus a week. There aren't many opportunities available to you to start a business or learn a vocation if you're living hand to mouth. That's not freedom. But that must not have occurred to Russell Vought, who built his career and his bank account lobbying for the Heritage Foundation, a Koch-funded corporatist advocacy group. $1.7 trillion in tax cuts for the rich under Trump, that's populism apparently. Supporting the working people who make this country great, that's a punchline to these guys. Compare David Asman's defensiveness about wealthy folks like him paying his fair share to how he talks about minimum wage workers.
The Apples and Googles will still be in business.
But you saw President Biden the other day. He whispered, pay them more.
Exactly. I mean, he sort of let the truth out. One of the reasons why they're doing this, they're not dumb economically in the White House. They realize that this is making it very tough for businesses. But you saw Biden say pay them more. The problem is a lot of these small businesses can't pay them more. And frankly, minimum wage is more for people who have other sources of income. Either they've got 2 or 3 jobs or they're living at home. A lot of them are teenage kids. They're going to have trouble once these unemployment benefits are gone. Imagine the trouble that teenagers who are trying to get their first leg up in the business world manage. They're not going to be able to find jobs.
Asman pretends that minimum wage workers are teenagers. A tacit admission, by the way, that these salaries are insufficient for an adult working full time. But that is, in fact, who minimum wage workers are, adults. Nearly 1/3 of all U.S. workers make less than $15 an hour. 1/3. 89% of workers making less than $15 an hour are over 20 years old. 57% of single working parents make less than $15 an hour. The same folks that want to force women to bring pregnancies to term are fighting tooth and nail to prevent them from getting raises, all while complaining about their own taxes. Meanwhile, in Florida, where a Trump-supporting majority also voted in favor of a $15 minimum wage, Governor Ron DeSantis has been fighting to subvert the democratic will of the people, saying, now is not the time. Well, when is the time, DeSantis? Well, you've been wasting time establishing National Victims of Communism Day. The residents of your state have been falling victim to the ravages of capitalism. There's a housing crisis in Florida, but all DeSantis can do is talk culture war. A local Palm Beach reporter wrote that there was a 22% rise in home prices last year, which brought the median cost of a home to nearly $500,000. But he wrote, quote, you never know it by the actions of state lawmakers who wrapped up their legislative session recently. Instead, they've mostly functioned as campaign operatives for Governor Ron DeSantis, fighting imaginary gay indoctrination in schools and fictitious Antifa hordes in the street, while supporting rewrites of history to make white students feel more comfortable about slavery. He goes on to write that about 1 in 5 workers in Florida are employed in 10 poverty wage jobs. Retail salesperson, food preparation, cashiers, waiters or waitresses, office clerks, laborers, stock clerks, janitors, restaurant cooks, and nursing assistants. These are the people real populists should be fighting for. After all, no one can keep the rain off their families' backs with a CRT-free math book. While former OMB director Russ Vought mocked the idea of spending money on housing, Americans, including Americans in red states, are the ones taking the hit. Housing costs are sky high as corporate investors gobble up real estate. In Miami, there's been an 18.8% increase in housing costs since last year. That's 22% in San Diego, 30.2% in Phoenix. Democrats are not immune from this type of mismanagement, but note, these are all red cities being underserved by their local conservative governments. And who is the culprit? Megacorp real estate companies have been exploiting the COVID crisis to kick out renters and jack up prices. Real estate tycoons have benefited to the tune of billions of dollars, you guessed it, in tax breaks. And for the first time in 20 years, the Chamber of Commerce was nudged out of the top lobbying spot by, guess who? The National Association of Realtors. And what do you think they're spending all that money on? Well, they will tell you. According to the National Association of Realtors' best practices for lobbyists, the top lobbying priority for the last 6 years has been ending the realty transfer tax. Yes, that is a small tax a municipality collects to fund affordable housing, public transit, sidewalks, parks, and schools whenever a property is sold. Despite huge profits and paying huge amounts in lobbying, cutting taxes at the cost of people who live in their buildings is this group's priority. It should come as no surprise at this point that megacorps don't want to pay their fair share, just like, apparently, David Asman. The real fight is not left-right, but top-down. Asman frames this segment around Biden, punching left instead of punching up. Biden is a problem. I do think he should pay his fair share, but it is important to identify the reason why he doesn't, so you don't fall in with some on the other side of the aisle who are just as bad or worse. Biden is a problem because he's bought by the same interests that motivate wealthy elites like Asman. Biden was the largest recipient of billionaire and corporate money in a crowded Democratic primary field. He is corrupt. And more often than not, he will bend to the will of the lobbyists who funded him over the people who elected him. It's important to recognize this isn't a partisan issue, or even a personal one. In fact, the National Association of Realtors' best practices makes clear that it is most effective when it is nonpartisan. As long as people keep falling for the DeSantis misdirection that tries to make an obscure law school academic discourse the enemy instead of his own failed housing policy, and the Democratic misdirection that privileges conversations about Trump, who hasn't been president in years, over its own failure to pass relief for struggling Americans, will get nowhere. And they know it. So, Robbie, I really wanted to talk about this today because it's not that I don't disagree with a lot of the cultural critiques, but it is so exhausting to see both sides falling into the trap where we talk about this nonstop and never talk about the real nitty-gritty economic stuff that's going down in states like Florida. Why aren't Democrats focusing less on CRT, frankly, as a rejoinder, as a way to push back against some of the Republican entrenchment there, and instead talk about how the people who live in the state are suffering? And they're suffering so much that even though they're conservative, they support this $15 minimum wage, which the Republican legislature down there has been fighting tooth or nail ever since they voted for it in 2020.
I mean, I have to confess, I'm not a huge fan of minimum wage policies in general, especially national, because $15 even within a state, it matters. There are a lot of places where that is woefully insufficient to survive on. There are some places where it's that gets you a lot more.
It gets you a lot more, but places where it's woefully insufficient to survive on have much higher minimum wages, like New York. Right. Even in Bessemer, Alabama, where that initial Amazon fight went down, that was an institution, that was a factory that was paying $15 an hour, which people were attracted to in the state, but was also a place with union activism because even people in Alabama, a low-cost state, felt like that wasn't enough to live.
Right. I think, but the problem, the reason people struggle with that amount of money is because the cost of everything is cost disease. It's the cost of education, childcare, healthcare. Right now, food and gas and things like that, that is an inflation problem. I look at so many of the sectors of things that have gotten so much more expensive as having had heavy government involvement and subsidization in, and I say, well, what are we doing wrong that it keeps getting more and more and more and more and more expensive to have basic education and healthcare when it other things that like TVs have not gotten more expensive. Products have not gotten more expensive.
Well, I pointed to some
Housing's gotten more expensive because we put artificial limits on how many freaking houses you can build.
Well, I don't know why you're talking about artificial limits on how many houses we can build when I just pointed to you the millions and millions of dollars that are being spent. The number one lobbying group in the country right now. The biggest spin is coming from these real estate companies that have bought up all of this real estate in the middle of a pandemic in order to kick renters out and drive up prices. There is not a housing crisis in the country insofar as, empty rooms for people to rent. It's that they are being kept empty to artificially drive up prices. Is that kind of manipulation by big corporate interests not a concern?
But why would you say that that's manipulation when the local zoning commission saying, no, you can't build a building here. This little diner is historically preserved.
It's not an inventory issue.
We need to knock that down and build giant. It is an inventory issue.
It's not an inventory issue. There are more empty houses than there are homeless people in America. It's not an inventory issue. It's a cost issue where people are trying to squeeze out these enormous amount of profits, as I've just detailed.
The cost would go down if there were more units available.
Right, but there are sufficient units available for people to live in, and the fact that people aren't living them is only because they know that they can squeeze people out to make an inordinate amount of profit. These are incredibly profitable sectors, and what they're all saying is we would rather screw over the population with the help of elected officials that are supposed to be looking out for us in order to turn marginally more profit. And at the same time, you have all of these politicos doing their work for them, saying that the enemy of the people should be the government, not for the reason that the government isn't working for you, which is a good reason to be oppositional to the government, but because they are, not paying enough in taxes. Joe Biden deserves a great deal of criticism. Ron DeSantis deserves a great deal of criticism. But what we should be asking is for, in my humble opinion, is for our elected officials to actually stand between us and the enormous aggregations of corporate wealth and power that are trying to squeeze out the little people for marginally more profit as we earn less and as we work harder.
Well, thank you, Briahna, and we'll have more Rising after this.